Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast where we explore the tension of being in the world but not of it. Today I'm coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. I've been here in Africa for 2.5 weeks on a mission trip. It's been amazing, and we have a great guest for you today. Alderwood missionary John Cross. John and his wife Amy have served here in Africa, originally in South Sudan, one of the hardest places in the world, for 10 years. They're now here in Nairobi, and we're going to talk to John not just about missions, but about reaching these hard places. What's it going to take for the church to finish the task? Can't wait for this conversation. So glad you're joining us. Well, John, it is not every day I find myself in Nairobi, Kenya. It is really awesome to have this opportunity to meet with you. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We get a chance to be with you and your family later, but I got you for right now, which is great. I'm a little grimy right now after 2 weeks, a week in South Sudan, a week here in Kenya, but I've just had an amazing time, and it's awesome to get to catch up with you a little bit. Let the folks back home know not only some of what you do, but something that I think is really important for us to consider as a church, which is, you know, we have missionaries. We've been sending missionaries forever. Some of us have grown up in the church, and we think about missionaries in far-off exotic places, but one of the things a lot of people haven't really grappled with is there are still 3 billion unreached people in the world. 3 billion people have no access to a gospel witness, or very little, to a church, to a Bible. And about 300 million people, unengaged people groups, don't have a Bible. They have no viable way to even hear about the gospel at all. Those are pretty staggering numbers. And I guess one thing I want to talk with you about, John, is how are we going to reach the hard places? And you guys were called in 2013 to a hard place. Tell us a little bit about where you and Amy started when you came to Africa and what's unfolded in these 10 years.
Sure. Well, we started in South Sudan. We were to go into Sudan, but all expats were kicked out as we were supposed to show up. So I went in and built a house in 3 days, a little prefab house, very basic, and we went into South Sudan. We began our language learning there. We helped out at Gideon Theological College, which consider it like a one-room schoolhouse for theology. And we spent a year there before civil war erupted. Our family is located here in Kenya now, and I continually go into South Sudan, and that's how it's been basically since 2016. In between that, we did some language learning in Egypt.
Right.
But yeah.
And I should just add, I mean, to set this up, South Sudan is the perfect example of a hard place.
Yes, absolutely.
To take the gospel. I mean, there's a lot of hard places in the world, but as just some backstory, which you know well, in 2012, 2013, we as a church missions committee decided we really felt the Lord was calling us in some new directions, and we really spent some time focused in prayer. You guys came to us during that time, heading to South Sudan. David and Bree Millard came to us in that time. And then World Concern, our wonderful partners who are loaning us this room right now, also said, hey, we've got some work in South Sudan. So we really felt a distinct call to this place. Newest country in the world, 2011.
Time,
yeah. Tell us why. Give us a sense of why South Sudan, among many places, is a hard place to bring the gospel and just to live.
Yeah, probably one of the main reasons South Sudan is a hard place to live and operate is it's very underdeveloped. Getting out to our locations, in most countries, you can get to those locations by road, and that's just not possible. So we have to fly out to where we're doing ministry. In addition to that, it's a country that has been warring for decades. Intertribal fighting, fighting with Sudan. There's racial aspects between tribes. There's racial aspects between lighter-skinned Sudanese and the darker-skinned Africans. In the news, it was portrayed as Muslims against Christians, where there was a bit of that, but it honestly had, having lived there, has more of a flavor of light skin versus dark skin, of just racism.
Wow.
Within the African continent. Yeah.
So danger is a big part of that. What makes it a hard place? Not to mention, like you said, those getting from place to place. You're taking an MAF flight, which gets quite expensive.
Or an AIM Air flight. Yeah, we mostly fly with AIM Air,
right.
but we have flown with MAF a few times. The population's very much armed. A lot of proxy wars have been fought in Sudan over the years, so people have AKs and Kalashnikovs, and people have long memories. And so if a small thing happens within the local area, the history is recalled, and then the fighting actually is bigger than it ought to be. But yeah.
We learned when we were there last week, and I'm sure you know a lot of this, but supposedly there's 3 guns for every person. So 11 million people population, there's roughly 30 million plus guns.
Probably.
So like you said, well armed. Yeah. And we also learned that going back to that war with Sudan over about the last 80 years, somewhere around 2.5 million South Sudanese killed was what I was told.
Yeah, and then even since the civil war within South Sudan, they estimate around 400,000 to 500,000 who have been
Staggering.
killed. When we moved into South Sudan, the population was 14 million. There's been 2 to 3 million who have left the country since 2013, which is probably why you have that figure of 11.
And tell that story a little bit just for people. You guys found yourself after building your house in 3 days in the Upper Nile region of South Sudan.
Yeah.
And what transpired in those first several months? Because it was pretty rough.
Yeah, so I built this house. It was basically a styrofoam house that had glass fiber on either side, and it was cased by aluminum, and then a high-density polyethylene key for you chemists out there that was holding everything together. But anyway, it was like living in a hot box concentration camp. You know, when you're in a concentration camp and you misbehave, they throw you in a hot box. You basically cook to death. That's basically how we were living.
Wow.
Later on, we were able to free up some ministry funds to build a secondary roof over the house, which kept the water out and the heat as well. Our house got up to like 120 degrees, and after we put the secondary roof on, it dropped the temperature down into the 70s and 80s. So then it became livable. So, but yeah, we were basically living in a torture box.
And that's you at that time with 4 kids.
4 kids, wow. Yeah. So.
And then things got really ugly here in terms of the war.
Yeah. So, 2013, the Civil War erupted. We say fortunately we had to medevac our child because if we hadn't have medevaced our child, our youngest got sick and was becoming dehydrated, and we weren't able to keep fluids in him, so we had to depart quite rapidly, and because of that, we were spared the tortures, or the horrors rather, of the war. If our child would not have been sick, we would have taken a boat down to Molokol, because there's an airport there, and where we were living there was not an airport for faster extraction. But some of the most horrific stuff happened in Molokol. Some of our teammates who were living there were under beds for 9 or 10 days. They risked going to the bathroom and potentially getting shot to do that. And then when they were finally able to leave, they had to drive over dead bodies to get to the airport. So the Lord really spared our kids from seeing that by getting our kids sick enough that we had to medevac him. So yeah. So
you and Amy have never been able to return as a family to live in South Sudan since then.
Yeah.
But God and the creative work you guys do through SIM, you've continued to go in periodically.
Yeah. Since 2016, I was heading up the clean drinking water ministry in South Sudan. And so I would go in probably 3 or 4 times, more than 4 times a year, but I would go in for about 2 to 3 weeks. And there I would lead Bible studies with the Water Project guys. We had 5 employees at the time. We would study a passage of scripture together, and we would usually work through a book. So about an hour to an hour and a half every morning, we would study scripture together. We'd teach them new skills. We would do inventory. And then some days we would have a shorter prayer time, and then we would go out and repair boreholes so that people could have clean drinking water. We would share the gospel. There would be tons of kids who would come around. So we brought in picture Bibles, and we would do some storing because most of those kids aren't in school. And so at least we're giving them some education and education about who Christ is and what that means for them. Yeah.
And let's just flesh this out a little bit more, because we've already established places are hard places, often because of lack of infrastructure, roads, etc., danger, war, that kind of thing. You just touched on the water. Health is a huge issue for people, cholera, things like that. And then, talk a little bit about the presence of Christianity in a place like South Sudan.
Yeah, so fortunately, in some areas, missionaries have come beforehand, shared the gospel, and there are fledgling churches. And even some of the churches like that SIM started 60 years ago, the SIC Church, Sudan Interior Church, sorry. Because of war, we've done some education, and then we've had to leave. And this happened in the 1940s, 30s and 40s. Missionaries were bombed by the North. Then we came back in like the 70s to the area where we're doing ministry now. And we were there for about 5-6 years. And then the Civil War erupted in 1980 or 81. And then we came back in 2006 to the Maban area. And we've been established there since, and actually that's the only base that's remaining. In 2012, when we joined the South Sudan team, we were in Khartoum and about 7 other locations within South Sudan and Sudan. And now we're just in one location, and that has to do with instability in the region. So by God's grace, we're still in South Sudan. So,
but correct me if I'm wrong, there's about 64 different tribes I heard, and so, you might share the gospel in one language, but there's 20 languages or something like that now in South Sudan that still don't have a Bible.
Right.
So, because people might say, oh, you had missionaries there, you planted churches there, what's the problem? Well, you've got all these tribes, right, that just, they don't cross-pollinate.
Yeah, that's one thing that we're noticing. But also, when there were believers from the previous times we've been in, war kills people. Yeah. And so you lose a lot of witness when life is taken. But yeah.
So hopefully we're painting a picture for people just of some of the many reasons that these are hard places to reach. You were talking to me a little bit about a map before we started.
Yeah.
Here, describe that map, because as we think about the world beyond Sudan and South Sudan, there's a lot of hard places that we haven't really been real quick to send missionaries to. I find a lot of people are quick to want to go to Brazil and France when they feel called to missions. Not that there's anything wrong with that. People need Jesus there too, but I don't find people necessarily quick to go to a lot of Muslim countries or countries where it's going to be dangerous. Right. Talk about that map you were describing.
Yeah, so we use this map in our security training and in our explanation regarding our theology of risk. And there's 2 maps. One of the map shows the areas in the world where the gospel has not been. So like Western countries like Europe and North America, South America, people have access to scriptures. It's been translated. It might be post-Christian, but the access to those resources are available. And so this map shows where the gospel hasn't gone, or where scripture has not been translated into languages where people can read them. And that might be due to literacy, it might be due to the translations just haven't happened. But if you overlap that map with the areas of the world that are the most violent, they coincide. And part of that has to do with the fact that when the gospel makes an impact within culture, it transforms that culture. Even when it's post-Christian, it carries some of the values that are taught through the scriptures. And so where the scriptures haven't been, they're dangerous places. Yeah.
and also places that don't tend to get nearly as many missionaries.
Correct. Yeah. The hard places don't tend to attract a lot of people. Yeah.
That hits home for me really hard too, because I have a 20-year-old daughter who wants to go into missions, and she's a go-getter, and she's the type that's going to want to go to the hardest places. And I have to ask myself, as a parent, wow, it sounds really good as a missions pastor to say we've got to get to those places. When it's my daughter who says, I'm going to move to a country where I might lose my life, or a lot of other parents, maybe I'm not quite as keen. Maybe I'm not quite as quick. It's going to cost us, isn't it, to reach those hard places?
It will.
Yeah. Well, John, this has been really good to just set up kind of what we're facing as a church. Let's take a pause here, and then I want to come back and hear from you. Why and how did God lead you to a hard place? So kind of keep backing up here. I mean, we found out about your life, you and Amy, and then 4 kids in this difficult place of South Sudan. But for many years, you worked for Weyerhaeuser. You had a steady job in the Seattle area. How did you and Amy feel that tug, the call, not only to go overseas in missions, but to go to a very hard place?
Yeah. Well, the initial tug for missions actually happened for me when I was in junior high. And someone came and spoke at our church, a missionary came and spoke at our church just regarding the physical needs of people and how providing clean water is a practical demonstration of love. And when people see that you care about their physical needs, they're more apt to have the energy, but also with a practical demonstration of love, they're more interested in hearing what you have to say.
Sure.
My wife had a similar calling around the same age group. I hate learning languages, so I had studied Spanish in high school, and initially I was thinking...
They don't speak Spanish in
No,
South Sudan?
initially I was thinking, let's go to a Spanish-speaking country. My wife had been praying for Sudan in college, and she said, I think we should go to South Sudan or Sudan. And I said, babe, just because you prayed for a country in college does not mean we need to go there. We were going to have our first child in the States and then head overseas. And our first child was preemie. There were some complications. It's actually a twin, and the sister didn't make it. And so we just thought, well, I guess that's out of the picture. If she's small and maybe her health's not good, going to a developing country is probably not going to be possible. So we hunkered down and got involved in ministry in Washington, serving in our church, youth group, leading Bible studies in youth groups, and then leading home groups. What do you call them?
Life groups.
Life groups, yeah, life groups, community groups, small groups, whatever you want to call them. But anyway, yeah, so we were doing that and just serving the Lord faithfully where we were at. And at our oldest daughter's 5-year checkup, the doctor said she's small for her size, but there's really no issues. So we started looking and praying about where the Lord may lead us. And the advice that we were given as we met with missionaries, one missionary in particular from SIM, which there's a cool story to that later on. His name's Jan Benke. Anyway, he said, go with a mission that you can get behind their mission and vision. Because when you go to the field, things inevitably will change. But if you're bought into where you are going and how you are going to go about it, you can ebb and flow with that change, which was such wise advice as we ended up landing on South Sudan, because things change on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But why we are there and what we are there to do, what meaning the long-term what,
Sure.
That's been unchanged. And so with the constant ebbing and flowing, the constant security risks, the constant closing and opening of bases, it's like, well, okay, that will happen, but why we're there is unchanging. And so it almost gives you like a steady rudder in a windstorm to know that you're headed towards that destination on the other side of the shore.
And what did you do for Weyerhaeuser?
I was an analytical chemist. So I worked in I worked in several places. I did some R&D with some of the businesses within Weyerhaeuser. And then I also did environmental standard method testing. Yeah.
And what I love about that is that that's not necessarily the standard track people think about for a missionary.
No.
But God used all those skills that you have, and He's put them to work.
Yeah.
I mean, the well drilling has been a huge asset for what you guys do. And then just you leading Bible studies, at the youth group. I mean, that's a lot of what you're doing here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. Talk a little bit about Amy and her work. She's an incredible lady. I wish we had Amy here. But just talk a little bit about what Amy's role is.
Yeah, her role's changed over time. When we were in South Sudan, she was homeschooling the kids and leading women's Bible studies and using stick figures and whatnot to communicate the truths in the passage. The book that they were going through was Ephesians, and they drew stick figures regarding what was happening within the book. Then after the Bible study, the women actually wrote a song. The South Sudanese wrote a song. And then the story Amy likes to tell is there was a 3-year-old of one of the women who were at these Bible studies, and he didn't speak a lick of English, but in his native tongue, which was, I think it was Uduk, he came over and he was drawing in the sand the picture that was describing the passage.
Wow.
One of the passages in Ephesians, and she could tell that his mom had taught him, and he wanted to show Amy that he had learned it.
Fascinating.
So that was pretty cool. After we moved out of South Sudan and settled here in Nairobi, Amy's helping with member care. And since then, she's been a chaplain on the Emmaus team, which is SIM International. She finished her Master's of Divinity in chaplaincy. And now that our kids are a lot older, we have them going to an international school here in Nairobi. And that school reached out to Amy last year while we were on home assignment and said, hey, would you consider being a chaplain for us? Which we talked about for a while, but considering the school fees and knowing that we would get a massive reduction in cost to save our supporters money, she's now doing chaplaincy at Roslyn Academy here in Nairobi, and it's now cheaper to send all 5 of our kids than it was to send 2 or 3 of our kids.
There's so many things you touched on there that I love just to point out to people. I mean, for one thing, you and Amy, extraordinarily gracious people, but very ordinary people. Yeah. I mean, here's John who just, worked a job like 100 people would work at Alderwood, and God used that. God takes Amy's skills and passion for people and has just opened doors for her. I guess I just bring that up because I think people often feel that if I'm going to go into missions, I have to be some extraordinary Bible teacher, or there's only this one way I can be involved. And God has used so many of your skills.
Honestly, we need a lot of people in administration on our team.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people who are gifted in evangelism and discipleship and teaching theology. We also have a lot of nurses on our team because we have a medical clinic in South Sudan. But where we are lacking is actually in things like project management and personnel and administration and finance. If anybody has any skills in those areas and want to serve.
People who have educational backgrounds. I mean, missionary kids have to learn as well. Often their parents are on the field, and so there's a lot.
Even though South Sudan is a hard place, our administrative hub is here in Nairobi. And so if people are considering missions and want to support the work and the efforts that are happening in difficult places, but don't feel that they're equipped to operate in the difficult places, honestly, there's a lot in Nairobi there is a different feel here than the West, but there's a lot that you can get here that isn't really not that much different.
And it's support for the people that are going to the hard places.
Absolutely.
One other thing I want to touch on here, if I'm not mistaken, Amy has done some trauma counseling and does do some, and I mean, to circle back a little bit again to the hard place of South Sudan, just because I've heard so many stories through you and others over the years, it breaks your heart when you hear stories of particularly women, not just women, but particularly women coming out of a war-torn place who've been through rape, who've seen horrible things, children who've seen awful things. Yeah. And it's hard to think about, hard to talk about, but that's another area where there's just tremendous need. Trauma counseling. I've met some trauma counselors here in Nairobi too, and it's brutally hard work, but so important for people who live through awful, awful things. Okay, John, that's very, very helpful. We're going to take one more break here and wrap it up here in a moment. Okay, John, this has been really helpful. Hopefully we've painted a picture for people, like we've said, that there is a lot of people still to be reached, 3 billion people at least, that there's a lot of very hard places to reach. We've heard your story. Let's think about the people sitting back in Washington at Alderwood Community Church, and anyone who might be listening to our podcast. They might have a tug towards missions even now, just been kind of stunned by this reality that there's so many who have never heard. What is it going to take for us as a church? And it's not just going to be the church in the West. God's moving people. There's missionaries being sent out of churches here in Nairobi, which is super exciting. But for the church to reach these hard places, what do you think is the most important thing the church needs to mobilize?
Wow. I think the most important thing, bar none, is to be lifting us up in prayer. We need prayer support. And we know that when the saints, the believers, are engaged in prayer, the Holy Spirit moves. And so prayer is big. In addition to that, in some of the ways that we are engaging, we need people to come and serve with us. We've started to be a little bit thinking outside the box in some of the ways we're thinking about ministry, and this came apart after a few years of me being the director and thinking through, like, what are our strategic goals for reaching different people groups, and then we took a look at what we had and what we needed to accomplish, and it's like, we don't have the people skills and giftings and finances to do this. So we've started by looking at some partnerships here in East Africa, and even raising up missionaries from places really that don't have the finances to send missionaries out, but they have the languages and the scriptural understanding to reach some of these people groups that, quite frankly, take us as Westerners way too long to learn some of these languages. Yeah. And so we're starting these new main ministries within our mission where it's going to incorporate some of that. So helping to fund that will help to fund certain believers crossing borders to minister to unreached people groups where we can't do that well. Yeah. And an example of that is Jan Banky, the same guy who we had talked with 12 years ago. He's been a missionary for the past 30 years in Niger, and he's been working with this people group called the Fulani. And there's a people group in Sudan that comes down into our area called the Falata. And we interact with them with Arabic, but that's not their native tongue. Their native tongue is a dialect of Fulfulde. And so we just said, well, we don't know if their language is even translated, or do we need to start mobilizing for that. And we said, well, let's just reach out and send some greetings back and forth between these Fulani in West Africa and the Falata in Sudan. And so we sent some WhatsApp recordings back and forth, and they were basically like, how did you get our language? And we're like, no way. So this last year, actually the first week of March.
So you're saying no one knew that these two separate people groups basically speak the same language?
Yeah,
that's
we
remarkable.
didn't know that. And so we brought one of these believers from the nomadic tribe in Niger and this missionary to Sudan for about 5 days, South Sudan, and we interacted with the Falata, and they understood everything.
Wow.
So we were able to present the gospel. 33 or 35 guys who had never heard the gospel heard it for the first time. They were so pleased to hear the good news of the gospel that they actually invited this nomadic Nigerian, to move his family over to continue to teach them.
Wow.
And today, that same guy and another Fulani and a Kenyan missionary to the Fulani in Niger got on a plane today to go into South Sudan for 2 weeks to meet up with some other of the Falata and to reconnect with the ones we did connect with. And we might be starting something new, but we don't have the money to do it. So a lot of us are using our ministry funds from donations that you guys have given to ensure that these guys can get out there so people can hear the gospel.
Wow. Do you have, John, any idea numbers for the Fulata? How many people would be in that people group?
2 million.
Yeah, that's staggering.
And there's like 5 major clans. And if we reach the ones that come down to where we are at, they will bring the gospel into Sudan, and we don't even need to go.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's mind-blowing. And you bring up Sudan, there's another country that's on people's minds right now because it's all over the news. And
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have to convince anybody watching this right now that that's a hard place.
Yeah.
But at the same time, here's the God who's active in our world pursuing lost people, and he's given you an open door, and now us an open door and an opportunity to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Thanks a ton for sharing that. I know it's exciting to think about these partnerships you're talking about. It is one of the things I love going on in missions. Even us sitting here right now, we're concerned with our dear brothers and sisters in Nairobi. I was just with a bunch of brothers and sisters, South Sudanese last week. God is bringing his people together. People can give, like you're talking about. People need to pray. But there's still people that are going to be called to go.
Absolutely.
And not everyone's called to go. But what would you say to someone who's maybe feeling a tug on their heart, and maybe God's calling them to a hard place? What would you say to that person?
The adventure of obedience to God is far worth the mediocrity of what you might stay in if you're fearful. The Lord will provide for you what you need as you move forward in the unknown. Just move forward. That's what I would say.
I can't say anything more than that, so I think this is a great place to stop. John, you and Amy and your family are a great encouragement to us at Alderwood. We're super grateful that we get to support you, not only financially, love having you guys around. You guys have been amazing with our VBSs, and every time you're back home, it's so good to have you. And we look forward to a lot of years ahead. But more than anything, I thank you and Amy for being willing to say yes when God called you to a hard place. And I know your story is going to it's touching Bryn and me right now as we're listening to it, and it's going to touch a lot of people. So thanks for taking the time, brother. It's a real joy.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you for supporting us. We really appreciate the encouragement that your church brings to us.
Thanks, John. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Native Exiles. Wow, I was blown away, as I'm guessing you were too, by hearing John share that very heartfelt, emotional story. And it's just one of many stories that we get to be a part of because of our connection with John, because of the God we serve who's doing these incredible things all over the world. I hope you'll be moved to act, to pray, maybe to give, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time on Native Exiles.